Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Rights and Responsibilities panel at today's edition of the Saskatchewan Festival of Words. My name is Amanda Leduc, and I will be moderating the panel today. We're so pleased to have you here with us. Just so you know how it will go, we'll start with some readings from all of the panelists and then move into a moderated discussion, and there will be a Q&A at the end of things. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are on the traditional lands referred to as Treaty 4 and that this festival is located on Treaty 4 territory, the original lands of the Cree, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect and honor the treaties that were made on all territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we are committed to moving forward in partnership with Indigenous nations in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. The festival is dedicated to making this a safe space for everyone. Any hateful language will not be tolerated in the events or in the chat on YouTube. The festival would not be possible without the support of our major funders, so we would like to thank the Saskatchewan Arts Board, Sask Culture, Saskatchewan Lotteries, the Canada Council for the Arts, and the Government of Canada, as well as a long list of program funders that will be shown at the end of this event. If you're in a business that you know supports the festival, please be sure to thank them for their support. And moving into the reading part of things, the first reader that I would like to introduce is D.M. Ditson. D.M. is the author of Wide Open, a memoir about faith and loss of faith, about sexual assault, and about the astounding human capacity to heal. In October 2017, Wide Open won the John V. Hicks Prize, awarded by the Saskatchewan Writers Guild to an unpublished manuscript. She has worked as a journalist and communications consultant for over 10 years and won a 2015 Director's Bursary Award from the Sage Hill Writing Experience. She is obsessed with telling the truth, which is a very good thing to be obsessed with. Welcome, DM.
Thank you, Amanda. So the reading that I'm going to share today is a piece I wrote as a journalist. And it is with a man who, well, you'll find out, but he invited me to go to a doctor's appointment with him. And it turned a little differently than I thought it was going to. I thought I was just going to chat with him in the waiting room. But I'll get right into it. When Rolf Heer's doctor walked into the examination room and closed the door, Mr. Heer got right to the point. "You know why I'm coming to see you? I want a medical assistant's death as soon as possible," he said. "I've been in so much pain, it's unbelievable." While his doctor empathized with Mr. Heer's pain and offered medication, he said, "My opinion is really to try and dissuade you from this line of thinking. Medical assistance in dying is probably not in your best interest." Mr. Heer disagreed. "I'm so sick I can't even do anything," he said. "Laying in bed is not the future for me." With Mr. Heer's prostate cancer in remission, his doctor said he doesn't have a medical explanation for Mr. Heer's pain, why it comes and goes, and why it's so severe that he's requesting medical assistance in dying. Their conversation went back and forth, with the doctor advocating for more testing and pain management, and Mr. Heer wiping away tears while trying to get his doctor to reconsider. What follows is condensed from their discussion. Mr. Heer: "You won't give me medical assistance death. Is that basically what you're telling me? You want me to suffer a lot longer, it sounds like." Doctor: "No, I definitely don't want you to suffer." Mr. Heer: "I can go to Switzerland and get it done." Doctor: "Rolf, what I'm saying again is that your terminal illness is under control." Mr. Heer: "Why am I so bloody sick? I feel that every day I'm getting worse and worse and worse, and there's no way out."
Thank you for that. Next, our next reader is Alicia Elliott, who is a Tuscarora writer living in Brantford, Ontario. She has written for the Globe and Mail, CBC, Hazlitt, and many others, and is also the co-host, along with Gregory Evans, of Why Though, a podcast about politics and pop culture that launched in July of 2020, and that you can listen to on whythoughpodcast.blueberry.net. She was chosen by Tanya Talaga as the 2018 recipient of the RBC Taylor Emerging Writer Award. Her first book, A Mind Spread Out on the Ground, has been a national bestseller for a very long time, like over a year. Welcome, Alicia.
Oh, hey. So I'm just going to read from my book. There's an essay called On Seeing and Being Seen. So this is just from that essay. I once entered a short story contest with a piece about a complicated relationship between two Indigenous women and lost to a story written by a white American man that not only appropriated, but outright misrepresented Indigenous ceremonies. His story featured stereotypical drunken, dysfunctional Indians, one of whom offered his white girlfriend, the story's protagonist, naturally, to his brother during potlatch. His brother accepted, and the two went off and had sex in the woods, the rest of the natives vomiting and partying around them. Potlatch ceremonies had to be held in secret from 1885 until 1951 because they were banned by the Canadian government. There was a raid on the BC village of Memcumlis in 1921, and 45 people performing potlatch were arrested. Sorry, I was a little stuck because I was trying to remember. I think it's pronounced Memcumlis in 1921, and 45 people performing potlatch were arrested. 20 of those arrested were sent to prison. I shudder to think of how their grandchildren would react if they read this story and saw how the powerful ceremony their ancestors fought for was turned into racist colonial poverty porn. The old questions emerged. Was this a story written by a white man in another country, more Indian than my own writing as an indigenous woman? Did this racist portrayal and cultural appropriation of Indigenous people matter? The story was otherwise good? That's the crucial problem with the push for diversity in publishing, something I've known my whole life, but have only recently been able to articulate. Diversity is not about letting those who aren't white make whatever art matters to them and their communities. If that were the case, it would not have taken me 25 years to find a book that represented Indigenous women in a meaningful way. No, diversity, as Tanya Canas so succinctly puts in her essay, Diversity as a White Word, is about making sense of difference through the white lens by creating, curating, and demanding palatable definitions of diversity, but only in relation to what this means in terms of whiteness. It's the literary equivalent of ethnic restaurants. They please white people because they provide them with exotic new flavors, but if they don't appease white people's sensitive taste buds, they're not worth a damn. And that's where I'll stop for now.
Thank you, Alicia. Next up, we have Naben Ruthnum. Naben won the Journey Prize for his short fiction, has been a National Post Books columnist, and has written cultural criticism for the Globe and Mail, Hazlitt, and the Walrus. He is the author, as Nathan Ripley, of the thrillers Find You in the Dark and Your Life is Mine, both out with Simon & Schuster Canada. He is also, if you do not know, the king of literary subtweeting, when he is on Twitter, that is, which is not all of the time, because unlike certain fools in this panel, i.e. yours truly, Naben is a very smart individual and knows when to step away from the twitter.com. Naben, welcome.
Hi, thanks, Amanda. Yeah, I'm going to read just a short excerpt from my first book, Curry, Eating, Reading, and Race. And this is just a bit about, it speaks to the responsibility part of the theme. It's just about how there's a pressure to write a certain kind of book if you're a certain kind of author. A trip to the subcontinent is supposed to be more than a holiday, and a book about people of South Asian descent is supposed to be more than a novel. An audience may demand that it fulfill the function of literary tourism, offering not just a glimpse of another place in time, but an experience of authenticity. And for the diasporic writer, he or she gains the experience of that pleasure, unique to tourists, of making a discovery, finding something real. The disconnected experience of being a person in the West, let alone a person of color in the West, doesn't lend itself to a sense of comfort or peace. Fitting your own story to a narrative where answers are to be found in a familial national past can be extremely soothing. Is there a problem with these expectations existing in the genre? Only that they constrain and limit the potential methods of expression for brown writers. No page can be entirely blank when you have a general idea of the shape of what you're supposed to write. For a diasporic writer, the hidden demand to play both tour guide and tourist could lead to a fulfilling negotiation of identity, family, and place. And it could also seal off other paths of exploration, other stories the writer may feel more driven to tell, to an audience that he or she may suspect doesn't exist. A tacit request from readers to create an authentic experience can, ironically, result in the opposite. False stories, or stories with false elements bearing truthful details and experience, built on conventions created by other writers and the categorizations of the publishing industry.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for those wonderful readings. I'm excited to dig into everything. I guess to start, I think it would make sense to maybe talk a little bit about the excerpts that you each chose to read, and I guess talk about, what sort of rights and responsibilities did you consider as the writer in creating these particular pieces and excerpts from your books? What choices and challenges did you encounter in the course of asking those questions? DM, why don't we start with you?
DM unmute.
Sorry. Okay, so my piece about this gentleman who wanted medical assistance in dying, I found it quite difficult to figure out what was the right thing to do and how to appropriately and with compassion cover this story. So a few days before this appointment, I had gone to this person's birthday party. So I'm a reporter in a small town, and so basically all of my contacts turned into my friends, which is nice. But so I had been at his party, and he didn't want to say hello. He didn't want to say how are you, and all of that stuff. He just wanted to talk about how he was in so much pain, and he asked me at that time to come with him to his appointment, and I agreed, thinking I was just going to be sitting in the waiting room, right? Like I thought I was going to be just his support person on the side. And I had no idea he was going to take me into his appointment. And so when it was his appointment, he brought me into the back with him when he was waiting for the doctor. And I thought again, okay, I'll just leave when the doctor gets here. But then the doctor arrived, and it just turned into this really quick kind of muddle of it's not appropriate for me to really do anything other than what this person wants for me to do. And so I sat in there in that appointment, and it was just, it was really emotional. It was tricky. And then it's such difficult subject to do. So what I ended up doing when I wrote this piece is I called him afterwards and read it back to him and said, here's what I'm proposing writing, but we don't have to do this if you don't want to. So I gave him lots of opportunities to change his mind. Which is important when it's such a sensitive subject matter too.
Yeah. Alicia, what about you?
So that piece I actually wrote, what was the catalyst for it? I feel like there was a catalyst for it. I can't totally remember what the catalyst was in general, exactly, but in general, the general catalyst was just the continuous ongoing conversation around cultural appropriation that we constantly have. And people talk a lot about the rights all the time, and I'm always talking about how no one who is obsessed with these rights, none of these writers are talking about the responsibilities, and I find that very interesting. As someone who thinks that as a writer, your words carry weight. At least presumably everyone wants their words to carry weight. So why are you being careless with your words? Why would you put out stuff that would perhaps unintentionally, but still it's still happening? Why would you put out work that would damage the very communities that you're purporting to write about? I don't know, because that's not something I prescribe to. But this is something that other writers obviously prescribe to because they're still doing it. So basically what I wanted to do in that piece in general was talk about, instead of focusing on what was wrong, I know in that particular excerpt I was talking about what that writer did wrong, but the whole piece in general is talking about what it's like when someone does that right, and what the difference is between someone who knows their responsibility and carries that responsibility with grace and respect and love. And how that is inherently different from the way that people who see other stories as a means to milk their cash cow. You know what I mean? Like there's a difference between that. You know, when you step away from a community, like the person in the piece I'm talking about, they didn't come from the community, so they could write about it, win this award, and then fuck off, essentially, and not worry about the ways that the people who read that piece, who were non-native, who may not have been from the West Coast, and even who were native, like who may not have known about the history of potlatch or something along those lines, they would have a totally stereotypical racist depiction of what a sacred ceremony looks like. And that to me is something that I couldn't do. And I wish that more people would, you know, when people are saying, hey, why did you do this? They would respond with, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Or some kind of honesty about, I actually didn't put in the work to figure this out. That's my fault. I'm going to take accountability for that. You know what I mean? Instead of just, well, I have the right to do it. They don't look at the effect, which is what I kind of wanted to talk about in that particular excerpt, the effect of these types of misrepresentations within, you know, the area of writing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I guess I should say, too, Alicia, I wanted to thank you as well for sort of raising that question initially. I know a couple of years ago we were at a literary festival and you asked that question in the course of the panel that you were on, talking about how we as writers often talk about, you know, your rights to write about certain things, but we don't talk about the corresponding responsibilities that come with those rights. And DM and Alicia, both in the instances that you're talking about, you're obviously talking about very different things, but there's a kind of weight that happens with a story that you have to carry as a writer. And people don't often talk about that as much as they do with just sort of the ability to get it all out there, right? And Naben, when you, in your excerpt, that question of the weight of a story and the sort of expectations that land on writers has, you know, plays out in its own particular way. What were you thinking about when you both wrote that excerpt and then, you know, in choosing it for the panel today?
Yeah, in writing it and choosing it, it was about sort of the responsibility that is sort of felt by a writer of color, and obviously this will vary across the races and across individual writers, but in this case, the sort of pressure to tell a sort of same old narrative of diaspora, but also I think there can also be a pressure on writers of color to create works of serious social relevance in order to be taken seriously, as opposed to, you know, works that may not easily be categorized as being super socially relevant. And it's an age-old conversation. Richard Wright wrote a review of one of Zora Neale Hurston's early books and criticized her for this. And they're both supremely great novelists, but he said that her work was not socially relevant enough. So it's an interesting debate. I like it. It's a back and forth one. But for me, it was necessary in writing this sort of first book to sort of, you know, reveal that my space was one of where I wanted to write whatever I wanted to, which I think is something that perhaps my other panelists would share as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That actually leads wonderfully into my next question, which is, you know, we sort of, we talk about this, right? The rights of the writer. And there's always sort of been this kind of nebulous understanding, I think, of what the writer's rights are. And I guess I would like to know what you guys think, sort of what are the rights that the writer has traditionally been deemed to have, you know, and what is built into that idea of the right to write. Take it away, any of you.
Okay, well, I guess I'll go. Since no one else is talking. Well, I think it's important to kind of also situate the context of, within the context of writing, to situate that firmly within a history of larger storytelling in general, because, you know, my, Haudenosaunee people in particular have a very long history of storytelling, and it's very important. We have our own ways of telling stories that we have had, and it's always been about kind of being able to keep things liquid, being able to, adjust your story for your audience. It's the whole idea behind oral storytelling. So like you have a story, but you can change it depending on if you're telling it to your auntie who is, super, super slutty and loves dick jokes, or you can adjust it to tell the story to your niece who is 3 years old. You know what I mean? So like that's kind of the difference between when we look at oral storytelling and written storytelling. And then when we look at written storytelling, it gets a little bit complicated because it's all, once it's on the page and technically printed in a book, you can't really alter it anymore. And so the difficulty to me in writing and is in trying to make sure that what you have as the one thing that you can give to your audience, you're not going to be able to cater it to every single person the way you would with oral storytelling. So you kind of have to almost basically anticipate what the audience is expecting and kind of either work towards those expectations or against them as you want to. So for me, the rights of a writer, like you can basically do whatever all it requires, technically speaking, to write is pen and pencil. Where it gets complicated from there is when we get into who actually gets to have their writing seen by people, who actually gets to have their opinion put out into the world, and get given books or get given articles. There's different things around there. So I almost feel like the question of the rights of a writer is almost superfluous because because we can't. I feel very strongly we can't have a conversation about rights without also having a conversation about responsibilities. So it's kind of like, which is something I already talked about. So I'll let other people talk. I'm kind of talking in circles at this point.
Niven, DM, do you have any?
Yeah, it's a difficult conversation to have in the abstract, I think, in terms of like what are the rights of the writer. I would agree with Alicia there that those two concepts are really interrelated. I mean, in general, I think the writer has the right to approach any subject, but then it's a matter of whether they can possibly do a good job of it, or if they're going to do a good job of it. And also when we shift into a nonfiction mode, like if you're writing a profile of someone, or if you're writing about a crime that occurred, especially if there are surviving people involved, or really paying respect to a potential victim of that, there are so many different things that outweigh just your right to write a story in the case of a journalistic experience that I just described like that.
Can I say just really quick? I think though that it's interesting because even then, the person still has the right to write the story. Technically, they like I said, like they can write it. It's just a matter of, are they going to be able to get it published? Is it going to be able to pass? If there's any kinds of barriers to publication, like fact checking, or any of those other sorts of things, which there are less barriers as more and more news organizations are losing money and having to fire people, or publishers not being able to fact check or whatever. But they still have those rights. I think that it's super important to talk about like the whole conversation around what you have a right to write. I feel like is the wrong conversation. It's not only the responsibility, but also like when we talk about when someone has written something that maybe isn't the best representation of the people that are in the situation that they're trying to represent. I feel like that question, the whole idea of rights, is a misdirection from the real question, which is, why do you think this is good writing? What I mean? Like, these people ostensibly think that they're doing a good job, but when they're the people who they're writing about, writing for, tell them otherwise, then they're like, oh, it's my right to do this. Well, yeah, it is, but it's also other people's right to give you criticism for that.
Yeah. I think that there's that thing that happens where people sometimes conflate the right to write with the right to be published, and the right to be published on, you know, a large platform, which we're seeing a lot more of in recent months, I think. And you know, that you can write whatever you want, and you can, the internet being what it is, put it out into the world, but you know, you're not necessarily guaranteed an audience. Particularly if you don't put the care into, you know, shepherding your story and shepherding the people who are a part of that story. I was in a workshop with the nonfiction writer Helen Knott, who is a wonderful, wonderful writer, earlier in the year, and she talked about, again, sort of in, you know, the journalistic side of things and the nonfiction side of things, and DM, maybe you can speak to this as well, of recognizing that when you're talking about other people's stories, especially, there's, you know, you have to take certain considerations into play. It's not just your story that you're shaping and putting out into the world. You have to think about the ramifications that it has, putting this out publicly into the world, might have on other people's lives, which I thought was really interesting, and speaks to the way that stories are very interconnected, in that sense that, you know, they have those kinds of knock-on effects, right? And it's not, it is, but it also isn't. You do have the right to write about whatever you want, but you don't necessarily, you know, that doesn't necessarily translate into you should necessarily write whatever you want, particularly if you are trampling on other people in the process. DM, do you have any thoughts about that? You know, I mean, the example that you gave, the excerpt that you talked about, you know, you're very specifically, you were asked by somebody to sort of come and bear witness, and then also, you know, to write down that story and share that story in that particular way. How did you wrestle with all of those kinds of questions?
Well, in that particular story, I thought, this person is in a very vulnerable situation. Mm-hmm. And telling me maybe what they're inviting me to do is not something that they have really considered the ramifications of, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, it was difficult. Like I said, it kind of ended up in the actual appointment itself a little bit by accident, because I was about to leave, and then he wanted me to stay. Yeah, when people share stories with me about like suicidal kind of thoughts, about drug addiction, about, let's see, what are some other ones? We've had some really tricky ones that I've been dealing with, and I really normally I would never send a story out to someone to approve. It's the opposite of journalism. But what I do in such sensitive stories is I've learned that I feel a lot better printing something if I'm sure that the people are. So I'll just give them a phone call and read it over to them. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But in terms of how interconnected our stories, and what you were saying about, sure, we have the right to write about whatever we've got, but doesn't necessarily make it something that should be published or should be shared or should have any broader audience than just our own journals. Mm-hmm. The advice that I got when I was writing my memoir, so it's about sexual assault, and it also has a lot of complicated family dynamic stuff in there. And so I struggled a lot with, what do I actually write and what do I actually put in here? And I was censoring myself as I was first putting it down. And the advice that I got from my writing coach was, just write the story now, how it is, and write everything that you feel is the story. And then we can edit it later, and we can take out and sort it all out later. So it was just a matter of kind of dump everything down first, and then really, what do I want to share, and what should I remove?
I think, you know, yeah, asking that and having that be a part of the editing process. You know, what do I want to share? How does this move the story? And, you know, what maybe shouldn't I share, or what should I step back from? Then, you know, comes into that question of responsibilities and how your responsibility as a writer to, yes, tell the truth, but then also tell it in a way that is respectful of your readers and also of the people that you're writing about. You know, that plays into this idea that we do have responsibilities to one another, that also then change according to the different genres that you're working in too, right? I mean, you've all had experience working in different genres. DM, you've worked as a journalist, and also in communications. Alicia and Naben, you've both worked in nonfiction as well as fiction. Do you see your responsibilities as writers changing according to different genres, as well as, you know, the expectations of, I guess, yourself, but then also the expectations that other people have of you as writers and the sort of lens that you put on the world? Does that shift or not according to what genres you're working in?
So I find that it shifts a lot between like part and what I find as a difference is in journalism, I am objectively telling something. And in memoir, I'm saying, here's my experience of the thing. Mm-hmm. And so at the very front of my book, I put a little disclaimer that said, this is not like an objective look at things. This is how it felt to me, and this is how I remember things, and this is based on my memories, right? So there's a disagreement that my mom and I had about one tiny detail. It was the color of a particular thing, and she is adamant that it's yellow, and I'm adamant that it's red. Well, we could get to the bottom of it, and we could figure out what color it actually really is. But I put it in as red because to me, in my memory, it's red, and I'm writing what my memory is. Right, so there's a little difference in terms of like I would never do that in a journalistic piece. In a journalistic piece, I would make sure like what the actual fact is, as opposed to the feeling of the fact.
Oh, I like that, the feeling of the fact. Alicia and Ben?
Do you want to go first?
I guess I do think it really changes for me based on project to project. I mean, the most recent piece of writing that I've had published is a profile of a real person, a chef, a woman of color in America. And to me, that was, you know, there's a lot of responsibilities there because you're representing somebody's career and their work and their life story. So I was constantly aware of doing a proper job for my subject. But I guess, I mean, there's a lot of overlap. When I'm writing about an experience that I have not directly had myself, I have a short story that's about a person of Mauritian origin, like me, but who's working in 1970s Rome as a sex worker, which is not my experience. Mm-hmm. He's a composer, he's a musician, which is part of my experience. So there's a large mix of things in there. Mm-hmm. And then all the material that I have to be sure that I have no experience of directly, it's important to me aesthetically to get that right, because if those elements of the story, which I've not lived through myself, pop out as being really fake or stereotypical or judgmental or moralizing in a way that seems very false to the character, then the story itself becomes not a good story. So in that case, though, I feel like the ruler is not so much my need to serve my subject well as it would be for that real life person, but also, thinking distantly of like, what if someone just had these experiences read the story, but also most directly, this story won't be any good unless I do a good job with these elements.
Yeah, that's true.
Sorry, guys, in advance if my dog is gonna bark in the background. He doesn't like noises in the hallway. I have far more experience now writing nonfiction than I do writing fiction, and for a while I wasn't totally sure why I could write nonfiction so fast and why I was so hesitant to get involved in writing fiction. Like I would have stories that I would be like, I can't work on that right now. I just can't. But whereas nonfiction, no matter how difficult it was, I still felt like I could do it easier than fiction. And it took a while for me to figure out exactly why. But I'm working on a novel now. So I've been kind of really in the thick of the fiction world. And it's interesting because I've been kind of discovering, I guess, that for me personally, I find that fiction is almost like a sideways version of nonfiction in a way, where like you take the elements of nonfiction and you kind of slide them in, but in a way that makes them, that like kind of pretties them up a little bit, or dirties them up a little bit, or makes them sexy or grimy or whatever, or scary. And, you know, I find that is fascinating, because, you know, we're taking these elements of truth. It's fascinating, but it's also tricky, I guess is the word I would use, because you can if you want to, because when a novel is working really well, ideally your brain kind of turns off and you're in that world. And you know, if you have like things that are like ring false, or you know, whatever, it pulls you out of that fictional world. Whereas you know, in nonfiction, you don't really have those things that pull you out of in terms of it not being realistic, because it's based on real life. So that I find kind of weird is that it's kind of manipulative in a way, I find. Like you have to be, I think, as a fiction writer, very clear about what you're writing and why you're writing it that way, for it to for your intention to be realized, I guess. And I think that some people don't ever have, like, they believe they write fiction, and it's doing a certain thing, but it actually is doing something else. And I think that them not being aware of the ways that their ideas about the world around them in terms of real life and nonfiction is informing their fiction, and being kind of manipulated by pretty words and characters and plot and such to give off impressions of the world around us. And they're not totally clear about the impressions and purposeful about the impressions of the world they want to give off. So I find that, to me anyways, to be a really fascinating difference between fiction and nonfiction. But, you know, as someone who's now in that realm, it's definitely something that's that I'm aware of, and I'm consciously trying to be like, why did I choose that line? Why am I like, what would happen if I decided to portray this character in this way, or if they did this as opposed to this? Like, you know what I mean? In terms of like, of me wanting the story to do what I want it to do, you know, and the character to be what I want the character to be, to give off what I want to give off. So it's all like very intentional. And I do find that fiction, because it's kind of a sideways thing to nonfiction, it makes it so that people who aren't honest about those sorts of things can get off the hook much easier than people who write nonfiction, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It raises sort of an interesting thing for me, because I write in nonfiction and fiction as well, and have been super conscious over the last couple of years of, you know, inhabiting that space of a writer inhabiting other spaces, right? And how do you make that balance between those things? I was asked recently to contribute to an anthology about mothers and daughters, and the first sort of knee-jerk reaction I had when I read that invitation was like, oh, I can't write about this because I don't have a daughter. I'm not a mother. And of course, that's silly, right? Because you can also write from the perspective of a daughter, or you can inhabit that fictional space. But I think it's interesting when you weigh all of those things and think, okay, what does it mean to really inhabit that fictional world in a way that shows that you're really asking those questions, right? Like, why are you choosing to write this particular story? How is this particular story getting the narrative that you want out into the world? And I think it's good as writers to ask ourselves these questions, to be that rigorous, because it shows that, I mean, authenticity is the word that everybody always reaches for, right? But Niven, in the example that you gave, I think there's something about ensuring that those choices that you make as a fiction writer and as a nonfiction writer are really integral to the way that the narrative comes about. Yeah, it's just, you're juggling so many questions all the time, right? Fun times, people. Fun times.
Yeah.
when it comes to nonfiction, especially, you're often tasked with the question of asking for permission in telling a story. And we've touched on this a little bit, but what challenges have you guys encountered in telling stories that involve other people in the world? And I guess you could apply this to fiction as well, because, you know, there have been many a time when I have written something fictional, right? And people see themselves in it, regardless of whether you actually meant for a certain person to be portrayed in that. How do you navigate that space?
I asked only one person. That was the person who it really mattered, that they were okay telling the story. Both shared about, not asking. I told them what I was doing, and I shared it with them, and I was really about what I was doing. But I'm not saying this as advice, I'm just saying what I did. And it was something that I quite a lot struggled with, because I knew that what I was saying was really difficult. Here's what I say, and here's what it means to say it, and here's what I'm trying to do with it, versus here's the impact that on the person. It was just some really weighty decisions. But in the end, most of the people who were in ended up saying it was okay for them to be in, or that they approved of it. So that was good, but it was tricky, and it was also difficult for my publisher too. When my publisher was going through my book, they were hesitant about a couple people being away, and we went forth, and then I was able to tell them I have the blessing. But it's a very good question. It's really hard to tell someone's attached to yours respectfully and with grace.
Okay, I can talk a little bit about that. I guess that I kind of, when I was writing my nonfiction, I knew that obviously I was going to have to be writing about real people, because I live in the real world and I interact with real people. When I was writing in particular about my mother and father in my book, I wanted to be very, very deliberate with how I was writing. I knew right off the bat that I wasn't going to ask their permission for what I was going to write, because I knew that I know this sounds harsh, but I knew I wouldn't get it, but I knew that, because I think that they were scared of what I was going to write without knowing how I was going to write it. So I think the best way for me to approach that, because I think very consciously about the impact of my writing when it goes out into the world. And as I was writing, I guess the best way to think of it is, or to explain it is, you know, when you hear yourself, when you record yourself and you play it back and you hear it and you're like, that sounds nothing like me. This is what I sound like. This is disgusting. Oh my God. Other people have to listen to this. Ugh. And you have that very ugh reaction. I feel like when you see yourself written on a page by someone else, you have that reaction, because the way you see yourself is never going to be the way another person sees you. And because you cannot see necessarily you can't see it all outside of your own perspective. You don't necessarily have the opportunity to kind of hear all the time how every decision you make impacts the people around you, even years down the line. I know, weird, right? We don't do that. But, I think that it's important that when I was writing, I was conscious of the fact that anytime you write about someone, it's disorienting to see themselves on the page. And so the things that I was writing about were not only ways that my parents helped to shape me in positive ways to become the person that I am, but also ways that they harmed me, maybe intentionally, maybe unintentionally. And I think that it's, to me, the ultimate question came down to, why do I want to write this? And the reason I wanted to write these things was because I came from a family where there of intergenerational violence, abuse, mental illness, and trauma. And I had been told my whole life that I shouldn't share that I should keep that hidden, that was something to be ashamed of. And I thought very firmly that this idea that I should be ashamed of it had hurt me more than, more than talking about these things would hurt my family. You know what I mean? And that's the thing too, is I knew I was going to have difficult conversations with them, and that I knew that after they read it, that they were going to have questions for me, or I was going to have to be accountable to them. And I wrote with that in mind. I wrote with, wanting to be honest, but also wanting to show them as whole people who weren't just caricatures. That was the main thing for me. I wanted to show their richness, the way that a person can hold both the deepest, most profound love for someone, and also this, well of self-loathing that comes out in sometimes very destructive ways against people that they love. So I think that those are things that, for me, kind of like the importance of doing that work, and making space for even my parents to talk about, the abuse that they've suffered as well, which they have talked to me about since. I think making that, talking about things, is a way to create that space. And as long as you are, bearing in mind that this is stuff that you are going to have to be answering for at some point, then, you will write in a way that, will reflect what kind of reaction you hope to get out of it, I guess.
Niven?
Oh, did you just call out to me? Okay, I'm starting to get some static. I can answer that briefly. So little of the nonfiction other than that profile piece that I wrote have been about people directly, but I guess I have been in Curry, for example. I do have criticism of people's works, particular writers' works, that isn't that kind, and I feel very comfortable there. I think the only person who I personally went in on a bit, despite really liking him, was Gordon Ramsay, and he can take it. So yeah, I don't have so much to add to that one, actually. Certainly nothing of importance.
That's fair. We're sort of approaching the end, so I'm just going to ask one more question, maybe a couple thoughts from you guys on this. I think that the question of, again, rights and responsibilities is something that is for both writers and then also for other people in the publishing industry too, right? We're all sort of, we all have a stake in this game, and the Own Voices movement in writing, which has sort of gained more traction in the last couple of years. The idea that we should be promoting and celebrating stories written by members of communities, particularly marginalized communities themselves. In the sense that we as writers have responsibilities to maybe refrain from telling stories, or from seeking to perhaps widely disseminate, widely publish stories that aren't our own. But it brings up the responsibilities of publishers as well, who act as gatekeepers and often have unconscious and conscious biases in CanLit and elsewhere. What do you think, in the sort of new landscape of the literary world, this sort of COVID strange new world in which we find ourselves, where certain stories continue to get overlooked? What should writers and publishers be asking of themselves and of each other?
I think, as much as the Own Voices movement is important and great, and also, though, I've been criticized for my crime novels not having white protagonists, despite many of them being about structural violence and whiteness. But also, I think, just briefly, the most meaningful thing publishers can do is not have 90% of editorial be white men and women, which it is right now. It would be great to have, instead of movements that are publicized, look how many writers of color we're publishing, give editors of color a salary and a mandate to publish whatever they want and what their interests lead them to. And I think that will lead to a less public-facing, marketing-friendly, diverse publishing, but it will actually get more interesting, good books from different points of view.
Yeah, sure. Alicia or DM, do you guys have any thoughts? You don't have to.
Do you want to go, DM, or if not, I can go?
I would agree with Ben in terms of making sure that there's representation, and also I feel like what my publisher did in a situation where there were a couple people that they were concerned about in the telling of my story, and where my publisher pushed back on me and said, "Are you sure you want to do it this way? Justify this too. We need you to convince us that this is an acceptable thing for us to be doing." And so we had that conversation. It was an uncomfortable conversation. I didn't like it, but it was an important conversation. And I think that those kinds of conversations are really good ones for publishers to be having, because as we were talking about earlier, people having the right to write whatever they want, it doesn't mean that they have the right to be sharing it and to be pushing it out. So I think there should be a lot of this effort from the gatekeepers, kind of to be making sure that it's and inclusive.
I don't want to repeat other points that were already said, but I agree with my esteemed co-panelists. But I want to just mention, because I feel like it's not a complete panel for me without mentioning how much I hate capitalism. So I wanted to just mention as well that, the world that we live in is interesting in that, we feel like, or we, that the way that we disseminate stories and art and entertainment is inherently tied to capitalism, which means that, if it is not, if it's dependent on profit, then it's always going to come back down to sales. And so, I am going to just full out say it. The only reason that the Own Voices movement is doing well, the only reason that there's a push for more BIPOC authors is because our books are selling, and our books are selling better than our white counterparts in a lot of ways, or are getting more critical recognition than our white counterparts. And the fact that we need to rely on capitalism as a mechanism to push forward diversity tells me that there's a problem with capitalism in general, and that, it would be, in an ideal world, we could, share stories and things like that, and all live the lives we live freely with things, all that we need, and be able to share art without worrying about how it props up our power or our career or our money. But we don't live in that world. But I also just want to put that out there, so that we are thinking outside of these very strict confines that are going to always, as long as capitalism is the structure that is that we are working within, it's always going to come down to bear on disadvantaged people, people of color, Black people, Indigenous people, disabled people, neurodiverse people, disabled people, homo, or I was going to say homophobes, but I'm thinking of something else. But that the whole that whole thing, those are always going to come down to bear, and we can try to fight them by putting more people into editorial positions, sure, but at the end of the day, that is still upholding the same system, which is inherently flawed. And I want us to kind of start thinking ways outside of this if we can. I don't have all the answers, but I do have, I do think that all of us have things to contribute to this conversation. And if we only think of things in a narrow box, then we're only going to get answers in that narrow box.
Mic drop from Alicia Elliott Thank you for that. I think we'll move into, we have a couple of questions from the audience now. So first question, you all write in many different genres. What are your thoughts on creative nonfiction, emphasis on creative, especially in this time of people picking and choosing what they take as fact? Is there a fear of people taking the creative parts as fact in that particular genre space?
So my memoir is creative nonfiction, but it's creative in terms of using plot, using dialogue, using those kinds of things. But it is not creative in terms of like embellishing things and making stuff up. And I think that with creative nonfiction, I think that just my personal opinion of it is that the creative part should be how you want to present it, but not what the actual facts are.
Mm-hmm. So creative in terms of like the style, as you say, as opposed to, playing loose with the actual facts of an experience.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I obviously love creative nonfiction. I feel like I'm like the traveling car salesman for creative nonfiction. I'm just like, everyone should write it. Are you a poet? Are you a fiction writer? Have you thought about creative nonfiction? Like, I'm always doing that. And I think it's because, like, obviously I love reading it, but there's something that is different, I think, from when I'm reading creative nonfiction, where you see someone who is actively grappling with the world around them without any embellishments in terms of, saying this isn't about a real person. Where this is a fictional world. In a fictional world, you can control everything. So technically speaking, in a fictional world, racism could not exist. In a fictional world, like, I don't know, like it's fiction. You can have giant robots, you know what I mean? Like these people who are obsessed with reality in fiction, sometimes it's kind of like, I wish that they pushed it a little further, but that's my own thing. That's for like literary realists. But apart from that, I think that, creative nonfiction is powerful in that, all due respect to DM, I have a little bit of a different opinion on that. I think that the whole idea of objectivity is kind of all a lie. And the whole idea that we can have an objective truth in terms of, especially when we're talking about events, when you look at brain chemistry and the way that it works, we don't actually remember things as they happen. Our brains work in that they have little flashes of memory, and we tell ourselves a story about what happens. And the more we tell that story, the more entrenched the neural pathways are. And so when we're relying on memory, it actually, there is no objective truth unless you have camera footage. And even then, it's about, interpretation. What angle are you at? Who was taking this footage? Did they start? When did they stop? You know what I mean? Like, these are the things that when we look at facts, you have to be very careful about what actually is a fact and how is this objective. When you look at statistics, when you look at all of these things, there's methodology around gathering this information the same way there is with history and the same way there is with journalism and news media. So I just think that we need to be very conscious of the fact that there are methodologies around these. They are crafted consciously by people who are subjective, who have conscious and unconscious biases they may not be grappling with when they are putting together this objective facts. And so I think that for me, the beauty of creative nonfiction is that you can utilize other things like plot, like structure, like style, like, you can do whatever you want. You can bring in other genres. You can do poetry, whatever it is that creates a truth that, is more than just a fact on a page, that feels like an emotional truth because it's someone who is reckoning with something difficult and coming to something out on the other side of something that they didn't maybe expect. I guess.
Mm-hmm. Naben, do you have any thoughts?
I don't write enough of it to really speak to it eloquently. So I would move on to the next one.
Sure. Could the panelists respond to the notion of objectivity in today's climate? There's the news versus fake news thing, but on the bright side, maybe an increased awareness of personal bias in writing. How How do you guys feel about?
Oh my God, that's hilarious because I was just talking about that. Okay, the bright side, there's an increased awareness. Okay, I feel like I just want to talk a little bit about the fake news thing because I think it's really interesting. Because it's something that is based on a real phenomenon of journalists, maybe, you know, especially in the digital age, there's this push constantly to be pushing stories out as soon as possible, which means sometimes you don't have the opportunity to fact check, or you'll say like there's a reports that this, but it is not confirmed yet. But the fact that you're putting it out there, even though it's not confirmed, I don't think a lot of journalists really think about the fact that just you putting it out there, people will see it and take it as truth. This is the whole reason why lawyers will ask questions they know that the lawyer will, or that the judge will, or that the other lawyer will object to in a trial, because all it takes is the suggestion by a lawyer for the jurist to be to have that put in their mind. And so when you have people who aren't who don't have the opportunity and who are put under pressure to keep putting out information without taking the time to actively check to make sure it's first, or it's good first, because they have to get the scoop or whatever. And
Alicia has frozen. Okay. Sorry, Alicia, don't mean to be talking over you, but I believe your screen has frozen. We are at time. So I guess just before we close, did either of you guys have anything else you wanted to add at this point, or anything else that you maybe wanted to say before we go?
I just really appreciate being part of it.
No, it was a really enjoyable discussion, and thanks so much for sharing for us, Amanda.
Well, thank you so much for taking part and for having wonderful answers to all of these questions. Thank you so much to the audience for the great questions in the Q&A. Thank you again to DM Ditson, Alicia Elliott, and Naben Ruthnum for being a part of the panel today. Thank you all for joining, and please, I hope you have a chance to check out some of the sessions that are going to be happening through the end of today. Thank you again to the Saskatchewan Festival of Words for having everybody, to the festival sponsors and funders for putting on a great event. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of the weekend.